Thank you, Chaz. I'm really very delighted to be in this room. I want to thank Heinz and FISA, especially Christy, who's such a national leader on disability, and to be here with Joyce Bender, who's such a national, in fact, global leader. It's just terrific to be here with you all, and that so many people came. I'm going to walk through, as you heard, some data, but I'm going to really start with why we're all here. Why are we all here? We're here because each of us cares about a variety of issues, and whatever your passion is, whatever impact you're trying to have, organizations are always going to be at their best when they represent the people that they serve. And that includes people with disabilities, just like anyone else. And so here are some faces of people with disabilities. And I know that by definition, people think of disability by what people with disabilities can't do, but frequently people with disabilities are actually the most talented people on a team. Think about the issue of climate change. Think about Greta Thunberg, who is out there on the front lines at age 16 with autism. You want people with disabilities on your team, on your staff, and as volunteers, no matter what the issue is that you work on. There are 61 million people with disabilities in our country, and they want opportunities and jobs just like anyone else. And as you've heard before, fully 1 out of every 4 people who's an adult has a disability. They're temporary because somebody got in an accident or they have an illness. They might be permanent. They might be from birth. They might be acquired later. I myself have an invisible set of disabilities. I'm dyslexic and I have ADHD. I'm a little over 5'10". I literally didn't start reading until I was over 5'10". So it's a real disability, but you can't see it, but it is still there. It impacts, as you've heard, every population. This PowerPoint links to role models who are African American, Hispanic, women, the LGBTQ community, which disproportionately falls in the disability community as well. It's every population, and it impacts most families, and many people have close friends with disabilities. So it impacts many of us. And as you have heard, it's a community that you can join at any time due to accident, aging, or illness. As you've also heard, there are a lot of students with disabilities. I was completely blown away by the presentation about what's happening in the schools. It's so important because there are 6 million school children with disabilities, the majority of whom are also students of color, frequently due to structural racism in under-resourced schools. You saw they have a cop, but no social worker. They have a cop, but no counselor. They have a cop, but nobody doing the early intervention to see if, like me, they have dyslexia. And so you see this large population of people with disabilities who have become incarcerated or homeless in our country. You know, through the suspensions that you heard about, you know, the dropout rate so very significant for students with disabilities, only 65% of whom complete high school, and only 7% of students born with a disability complete college, only 7%. Almost always from white 2-parent families. So this is an issue where if you want to have people represent the community, it's very important to invest in leaders of color with disabilities and making sure they're on your teams and figuring out how to deal with that if in many cases, as is the case, they don't have that college degree. I'm going to skip through some of this data so that because you heard from Joyce about this low rate of employment for people with disabilities where only 1 out of every 3 working age with adults with a disability has a job, but you will see that this also disproportionately impacts people of color with disabilities. Let me just put in a plug for data. Are there any data nerds here? Let me just say, track this. In your community, there is data on all of this. Take a look at a granular level on what's happening here in Pittsburgh to these populations, because right now, today in America, there are 8 million working age people with disabilities who aren't working and who want to be working. And so we can really help. And this database right here will give you all the local data on Pittsburgh so you can really drill down and see what's happening. Because again, we're going to go back to this. Problems are best solved by the people who know the solutions because they have the lived experience that helps innovate and find those solutions. This is an example of somebody who is a wheelchair user giving a speech at a religious institution. Most people don't realize that religious institutions are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in fact, the most barriers of any institutions in America are usually religious institutions. Ginny Thornburg here from Pittsburgh has actually been one of the national leaders on this, but what they've done is they've taken the podium and they've made it lower so that somebody can give the speech. They're innovating because people with disabilities can really innovate. And also what we see in the data is that people with disabilities, they don't job hop as frequently as a lot of today's millennials and others do. They find a place that accommodates their disability needs, they get comfortable, and they really thrive, and they really, really help organizations, and their longevity and loyalty is much higher than those without people with disabilities. And we see that 85% of voters want presidential and other candidates to make sure their campaigns are inclusive of people with disabilities. And I have to tell you that last campaign cycle, that was not the case. Not a single presidential candidate had an accessible website in the last presidential campaign. So this is really important. People with disabilities don't want to just vote on election day. They want to volunteer. They want to go to town hall meetings. Can they get in the door? It's a really important question. So we took a look in philanthropy. So you heard from Darren Walker, who's really been a role model on this, about the changes that he has made that have been quite transformative. How different is he than other people? I will tell you, he is really a trailblazer out there ahead of others. We did a major study, and so here's what the major study started with. First, we did 5 focus groups of philanthropists along with the Council on Foundations. And we found things such as, we don't know anybody with a disability who wants to apply, or we're a small office with not a lot of turnover, and we really couldn't take somebody who couldn't carry their weight. Because there was so much stigma that people with disabilities couldn't produce. We then did 14 one-on-one interviews with CEOs of philanthropy organizations. And these are organizations largely engaged in equity initiatives around race or gender, LGBTQ. It was very hard to get these CEOs to do the interviews because they said they had no knowledge of the topic. And in fact, when they finally agreed to do them, they mostly talked about how even though in their careers, all they do all day long, it seems, is advance equity, as Darren Walker was talking about, they had never, ever thought about disability. They were all for inclusion. They had no idea what that meant. Then we needed to see, could it be statistically, what is it like if you go out to the whole country? So our partner was the Chronicle of Philanthropy and a publication called Nonprofit Times, who each sent the survey to their list, and we had a sample size of about 1,000 people. Here's some of the findings that we got. Number one, the good news is that 75% of people who work in the social sector want to be inclusive of people with disabilities. So the will is there. 75% want to be inclusive, so much so that they say that they have a specific policy to be inclusive of people with disabilities. So the talk is there. The walk or the roll is not. And here's where the rubber meets the road. Number one, only 59% are even attempting to do their events in physically accessible locations. Only 59% are even trying, which means that 40% of the population of people who use wheelchairs cannot even think about going to their events, number one. Number two, only 41% have a process where employees, trustees, board members, and volunteers can request an accommodation. So let's say you're deaf and you want to have a sign language interpreter. There's literally no place on the registration form to even request that. If you have a food allergy and you're allergic to gluten, there's no way to request that in the vast majority of cases. we looked at our public events enable people with disabilities to request the accommodations. The public events and inside the organizations, no way to request accommodations. We enable people who are blind or have low vision to be able to access our materials on the web by ensuring that our website is set up properly for screen readers. Only 17% are even attempting to make their websites accessible, and only 14% are attempting to put captions on their videos, meaning that anyone who's deaf or hard of hearing, which is, by the way, 38 million people in our country, have no access to the videos that they are making. What we did see is that the majority are serving people with disabilities. 66% say they serve people with disabilities. 42% said that there was at least one person on their staff who had a disability, and approximately the same said they had at least one volunteer with a disability, but only 24% said they had even one board member with a disability. Now think about it, because we're 1 out of every 4 adults. 1 out of every 4 adults, most boards have 10 or 20 people on it, and yet you have almost 80% saying not a single member of their board has a disability. So this is really, really important finding. And we also see that this is true amongst the leadership cadres as well. And so we also saw, in terms of messaging, so I go to a lot of equity conferences. Anyone feel that equity conferences are infotainment? Infotainment, you know, you check the box, it says sort of been there, done that. But does anything change because you got a little better informed? Frequently not. So you have to set very specific goals. Very specific goals, and those goals have to be around the success of the organization and what the organization is trying to deliver. It's not filling out a box for the box's sake, it's about being more impactful around your mission. What we did find is that the negative messages, in other words, talking about how crappy things can be for people with disabilities, actually backfires. That when you say things like only 1 in 3 people with a disability has a job, people with disabilities are twice as likely to be poor as people without disabilities. They are disproportionately impacted by issues of school suspension, dropping out, unemployment, homelessness, abuse, incarceration, and other issues. Only 7% found that to be compelling. Now, why is that? Why is that? I mean, we're in the do-good business, right? And it didn't work with people in the do-good business. Why? We found that people are really saturated with emotional exhaustion about how challenging our work is, that we're trying to make the world a better place. We never have enough time, treasure, talent, and then there goes another tweet, right? So people find that they're in defense mode and they don't want to take on what they perceive to be somebody else's loser agenda that's going to be hard. But what they do resonate with very, very clearly is this fact, which is true, that organizations are at their best when they welcome, respect, and include people of all backgrounds. This includes people with disabilities. It's very important to do public opinion research and to use the messaging that will bring equity and success forward, because we've all seen those failed equity agendas that just don't move the needles. It's very helpful to do polling to see what will incentivize people and inspire people to actually make changes. So this is just, you know, some more polling on that. I won't go into it in detail, but really showing the positive outcomes that you can get by including people with disabilities, and that disability lens and accessibility is what really will inspire people to do the kind of work that we are all doing in this room here today. So these performance metrics matter. You know, are your members or grantees representative of the people that you serve? How many of you are in an organization that asks if you are serving, you know, if your team reflects the people you serve? Are you asking if your team reflects the people you serve? That is fantastic, because you will serve your customers better if you represent those people. What we're finding is that not enough people do that, and when they do that, they're not asking about disability. They're asking about gender and race, and they're leaving off disability. And additionally, we're finding that they're not asking people to include people with disabilities, even in the work that they're paying for. I'm a big believer in the golden rule. Does anybody know what the golden rule is? He or she who has the money makes the rules, right? He or she who makes the money makes the rules. So we'll talk about that, because if you're a grant-giving organization, you have the right to say that your money will not be spent to expand prejudice, to block access. You as a funder would not deny access to your programs to people of color. You would not want people from the LGBTQ community to be excluded. Why is it that we, good, well-intended people, are excluding people with disabilities from the work that you are doing, especially since most of it is actually free to accomplish, free being my favorite price because I work for a nonprofit organization. Pictures are very important. We're seeing that people in their annual reports, on their websites, don't even bother attempting to have a person with a disability on their website. You can go to foundation or nonprofit website one after another and find not a single person with a disability. And if there is a person with a disability, it's a stock photo of some model pretending to be disabled, sitting in the kind of wheelchair you use temporarily in a hospital, not a real wheelchair. Like, use a real person who really uses a wheelchair and show them in your real program along with non-disabled people, and make sure that you're using those pictures, because a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And we saw that 3/4 of the field had never even attempted to recruit somebody with a disability for their team. So how do you change? How do you make this change? What did we find from the resource, or the key tips? So I'm going to give you the 10 tips. Not 10 commandments, but it's the 10 tips. Number one, you need to commit to making it happen. And that commitment needs to come from the top, and it needs to be just as Grant Oliphant and Darren Walker and Christy Troutman and others talked about it up here. It needs to be from the top, and it needs to be consistent, that you want to be inclusive of all people, and all means all. Number two, when people with disabilities aren't at the table, they're on the menu. So you need to really make sure that no matter what your issue is, there are people with disabilities being impacted with it. Are you making sure that they're at the table to discuss that issue? I mean, climate change, that issue completely impacts people with disabilities. Every time there's a fire or an earthquake, everybody runs away and leaves the people with disabilities behind. If you're on oxygen, they turn off the power in Northern California and they just forget about you, and literally people are dying. Climate change is a really big issue for people with disabilities, but every issue is a disability issue, so it doesn't matter what you're working on. If you've got a team sitting at a table and you look around and nobody has a disability and knows about disability issues, see who you can get at that table with you that can help you be stronger and to really build an inclusive environment. That doesn't mean that you're going to know all the lexicon and all the politeness of disability etiquette on day one. I understand that this is in the Twitterverse, that we've got a bit of call-out culture, where if somebody isn't PC enough that we insult them and then we cancel them. But I have to tell you that the disability community wants to go very gentle with you. If you don't get it right, but you have good intentions, we want to help you walk that walk or roll that roll and get it right. Just ask us. I always say ATP, ask the person. What can I do to make you feel comfortable here? Is there anything we can do to help you have your best performance here? Just ask people. Use the right lexicon, and really the book has some nice tips, but there are a lot more tips, and Christy's going to have them on this great website that she is building with tools that you can use, and really work with people with disabilities. Joyce Bender can really help you. Here's some other resources like TAPability, AskJan.org, and others. And we have, at RespectAbility, we offer free webinars on all of these topics, which are all on our website, and all kinds of toolkits that hopefully you'll find helpful. Always have a point person. One of the things in a nonprofit that really guarantees failure is when everybody is responsible but nobody is accountable. make sure you have somebody who is accountable, who is the point person to make sure this agenda is going to move forward. Let's say, for example, you have a fabulous event and you want people with disabilities to feel included, and on your application form, somebody says they want gluten-free food and somebody else asks for a sign language interpreter. What if everybody thinks somebody else is going to take care of that, and in fact nobody does, and the person comes and none of those accommodations are put into place? So you have to make sure that those things are taken through. Include people with disabilities in your marketing and in your photography. Really ensure that your resources are accessible. Let me give you a secret. It is free to put captions on videos, and it is instant. Go back tonight and look at the videos on your website. If you take those videos and you create your own YouTube channel and you put all of those videos on your YouTube channel, believe it or not, there's an algorithm that will instantly and automatically put captions on all of your videos instantly so that people who are deaf or hard of hearing can use them. Now, they will spell my name wrong every single time. So you have a human being go in and make whatever corrections you might need to clean it up, and that's really important to clean it up. But it's very easy, and we have a tutorial on our website to help you do that. Look, these are things that people can do for free, because the nonprofits are always saying, I don't have enough time, I don't have enough money. Well, you know what? Free, you have enough time, you have enough money. You can really do this. And you can always make sure that your public events are in places that are accessible. There is no excuse to use that church basement that is down that flight of stairs when there's a public library or a public high school or a great place like this. You should always make sure that all of your public events, and in fact, I'm going to encourage those of you who are grant makers to write it into your grant agreements, that in your grant agreements, 100% of events will be in accessible locations, and I encourage you to put in your grant agreements that 100% of videos will have captions, because both of those have no budget implications whatsoever. It's just time. The Chicago Community Trust has done a wonderful guide, which is one of the toolkits on Christy at FISA's website. I encourage you to look at it. You can also invest in vendors with disabilities. Our organization is working in Hollywood around the portrayal of people with disabilities in Hollywood, but we're currently casting for a TV series that will be a reality show where everybody will be a person with a disability who has started their own business. And we're very excited about it, but there are disability-owned businesses, and you can use them to source some of your stuff that you use, and to really just be sure to communicate with your grantees that this is a priority, that you wouldn't want an organization that you support to exclude people of color, people from the LGBTQ community or women, and that people with disabilities should be included just like anyone else. The Ford Foundation is a real success story. They've done it, and they've really documented it with a lot of information. These are some of the links to some of that information. And really, the takeaway is that when you include people with disabilities, no matter what area you're working in, your work will be stronger. And so there's lots of tools also at RespectAbility.org's Inclusive Philanthropy Toolkits. We have trainings on all these topics that are going on. You're welcome to sign up and join us. And now I am ready to take any questions that you have. Thank you so much. I'm going to congratulate myself for, I think, being the first unchimed speaker. I gave you all 6 extra minutes for questions. I think there's people with microphones here going around. Do we have questions?
Hi, Joni Schwager from the Staunton Farm Foundation, and I'm interested in invisible disabilities. Some people come to us and say that they are afraid to disclose their disability to their employer because they fear being discriminated against.
Right.
And I know that it is against the law, but what to do that, but hard to prove, right? So what advice would you have for those folks that ask us that question?
So first of all, you have to be very sensitive that you're not supposed to be asking people, do you have a disability? You're asking people, do they need an accommodation to thrive here in this work environment? And if somebody needs an accommodation because they have a mental health condition, which, by the way, is the #1 most common disability, is a mental health condition, they should be able to go to their employer and say, on Wednesdays, because of a disability reason, I need to leave early. I'm wondering if I can come early or on some other days of the week. Or, for a disability reason, sometimes I may need to work from home. Can I do that? Would that be okay? What's the process? How do we document that? People don't have to self-disclose that they have schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or anxiety or what medications that they're on. They should be disclosing what they need to have as a performance enhancer to enable the workplace to be the most successful place possible, not only for them, but for their colleagues. And that should be true as we try and respect everyone. Let me also just say that parents of children with disabilities have to go to something called an IEP meeting, an Individualized Education Plan meeting, every year during their workday. And a lot of workplaces don't let parents off to go and visit with their teachers of their child. And this is a very important accommodation to have in the workplace. Just like you have maternity leave, you need to look at the family medical leave, that if somebody has a child with a disability and they have a parent-teacher conference around that disability, they should be able to get off and they can make up the time some other time. Yes, thank you for that question. It is mental health, the #1 most common disability today in America. A lot of people don't like to use those words. So more and more organizations, because so many people have them, are calling it wellness. It's our new, word, wellness, and mindfulness. And they're offering programs, and I think that that is a really, really good idea to offer mindfulness and to offer wellness programs in workplaces, because in today's environment, whether you have a biological mental health condition or it's just environmental from the toxic stuff we see on TV, it's a very real issue. And helping people deal with those issues and having toolkits to help provide them and to have speakers come in and talk about those on a regular basis can be really, really affirming to your team. Yes, other questions? Y'all are quiet. For how many of you is this your first time really spending a day thinking about disability issues? First timers. So we have a lot of veterans here. Okay, let me hear your questions.
Is it on? Okay. I just wanted to kind of question or push back on the idea that it's free to caption videos, because going back and taking time to fix those does take time, and time is not free, of course. And why wouldn't we, press an organization like YouTube.com to get actual humans to work on that, as opposed to taking our own time?
So I think that it's great for foundations. Some foundations, for example, JP Morgan Chase has an accommodation fund, a centralized fund, that any organization that is one of their grantees, if they have a national conference and somebody requests an accommodation, let's say they want to have somebody who's a wheelchair user use a stage. Well, obviously it costs money to put up a ramp here, or have a sign language interpreter. That's actually expensive because you have to have two, because they get tired, they're working hard, and you rotate them, and some people don't understand that. You have to budget for it. So JP Morgan Chase has a philanthropy fund that provides that for all their grantees, so that at no point is somebody who's one of their grantees denied from participating in their programs because of a disability, which I think is phenomenal. But getting the technologies, companies to pay for those things, to do the typing, what they're working on, for example, people who are blind are on Facebook and Twitter constantly. Not all of them, but many of them constantly. And if you save your photograph with a name, like let's say you take a photo here at the conference, and if you save it with the name of the person or photo of person or whatever, the person knows what it is. When Darren Walker's, was talking about his equity thing that he announced, I was actually somebody who reached out to him right after it. He announced it in a tweet that went to a picture that was not screen reader accessible. So anyone who was blind had no idea what the text was. It then went to a video with no captions that then you could go ask at the building that was not physically accessible. And then if you wanted to apply for a grant, they used Flux, and I think some of you might also use Flux, which is not accessible to people who are blind. And so Flux is currently working on the grant application forms to make it accessible so that people who are blind can apply for grants. But many technology companies are trying to step up their game. So for example, we've been working with Facebook and Twitter to try and help them use artificial intelligence to pre-label photos for us so that people don't have to go in and manually do that. That's another thing that's important to do, is to have your social media be accessible. Yes, it takes a little extra time to just save the photo with a description of what the photo is. It'll be nice when artificial intelligence will step up its game enough to be able to do that without us having to do it manually. Yes.
So I think you said 75% of organizations say that they want to serve people with disabilities. But I'm curious what you think is going on with the other 25%, because that's not a negligible number. That's a fairly high percentage of nonprofits and philanthropy organizations who are specifically saying no to serving people
They're
with
not saying they
disabilities.
don't want to include. We're asking them, do they have a policy to include? So they don't have a policy saying I won't include, but they don't have a policy to include. But there's a huge gap between policy and practice on this particular issue. I will also say that there is a pretty big partisan gap because, just like some people, almost all Democrats, according to polls, are really worried about climate change. And almost all Republicans are worried about fake media that's selling fake climate change. So it's very hard to get everybody in the country to agree on facts. Luckily, disability issues are very bipartisan. That, you had Dick Thornburg involved as a Republican. You had Bush, who signed the bill, who was a Republican. My chairman of RespectAbility, Steve Bartlett, was the primary Republican author, along with Democrat Tony Coelho. The disability can be completely bipartisan because it impacts every family, regardless of their politics. And interestingly, some of the families that are most passionate about disability rights are people who are pro-life, who are very concerned about eugenics around the stigmas that are telling people to abort all fetuses that have the potential to be a child with a disability. Yes.
Okay. So what advice or resources do you have for boards or organizations to really include a variety of disabilities that we see so often, physical disabilities, multiple physical disabilities being addressed, but having somebody with intellectual disability at the table in a meaningful way, their voice heard and discussed.
Right. So the question is, how do you make sure that that equity and that authenticity is actually joining your team? Well, first of all, I do these presentations all over the place, and afterwards, frequently, people come to me and say, I've been living with bipolar disorder for 20 years, but no one at my office knows. Or I've been living with cancer or chronic pain or dyslexia, nobody knows. First of all, I would try and create an open work environment where people can feel comfortable self-identifying as being a part of our community. And you may find that there are people who are in your space already who may have never said a word about disability because of the stigmas around it, or at least the perception of stigma and what it might do to their career, that you may find that there are people on your team already who have all kinds of expertise. Maybe it's them, maybe it's a member of their family, because as a parent or a sibling or a child, they may know disability in that way. But then what I would say is that there are really responsible disability organizations that the disability community, by the way, I'm just going to have to explain something as to why RespectAbility, which I'm the co-founder, has started. That's because the disability community is made up in silos of white two-parent families who have a kid with disability X, right? The disability community, there's like a Federation on Blindness, there's autism, there's spina bifida, there's very little, everybody comes together. And when people are working together, it's generally there was a family of relative educational and other privilege that then their kid had a disability and their kid's getting the shaft, and so they want to save the world for their kid. Not realizing, you know what, the majority of children in America who have a disability today are children of color. And so right now, the ARC of the United States is actively looking for people of color to join their board of directors because they know that the ARC is a largely white organization. And they're currently, you should see it, this is a complete role model. They have essentially an RFP for people with intellectual disabilities, self-advocates, and people of color and people from the LGBTQ community to join their board of directors. They have put out a national call with like a 4-page memo, and it is a model case study of if you don't know the people, go and find the people. Put out a broad search. But if you want people, there are great organizations. The ARC for people with developmental disabilities or Best Buddies. There are organizations for every single kind of disability that can help you with those particular specific issues. I mean, our organization works in Hollywood around portrayal, and so, for example, I don't know if you saw this week, we are super excited. The next Marvel superhero will be a woman of color who is deaf, played by a woman of color who is deaf. It takes a lot of intentionality. How am I doing on time? I'm okay. So other questions? Yes, right here.
How do you get individuals from the community who are of lower income to participate? Because most of the people
How do you
on
get
boards
individuals from lower income? Okay,
yeah.
this is really important.
Yeah.
People with disabilities are disproportionately super poor, and access is a super big problem. So if you want them to join your board, you better up front tell them that you're going to pay for Uber to come pick them up, wheelchair Uber, if you have it in your community. We have it in Los Angeles and in some other cities. If you don't have it here, start lobbying for wheelchair Uber. It's fabulous. But you need to pay for transportation for them. If there's a meal, you need to make sure it's covered for them. And you need to make it clear that you will take care of those sorts of things. And in some cases, people pay community activists because, you know, emotional labor is labor. And bringing your lived experience is experience. And so more and more organizations, look, I work myself as a person with white privilege. I'm working deeply on racial privilege. And the last thing my African-American friends want me to do is say, hey, as an African-American person, what do you think about X? They're like, don't you have a consultant for that? I'm like, yes, I do, and I pay her. And she is the person that I ask those questions because that's her job, that's her specialty, and she brings that knowledge to me. I don't need to put my friends out or to put my employees out to always share their lived experience unless they want to, and that's a role that they're really willing and excited to play. Yes, and I know that this community has some real experts, whether it's Joyce Bender or Stein or others who are in your community that have been working these issues, and I think they'd be very generous with their time, but I do think that time is money, and it's great if you can have a budget to pay them.